Hey, good morning, church. It is good to worship with you on a rainy morning, is it not? No better place to be, in church, in the rain, and I am glad that you're with us and want to welcome our campuses to be with us as well, and also those of you online, it's great to have you. I am super stoked because we are starting a new series this weekend on Next Gen, and for the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about the next generation, and you can be here and maybe you're 16, or maybe you're here and you're 60. What you have is something that you can give away, and what we're talking about in this series is what you can invest, because all of us have something to invest, and we have something that we can give away because of our faith in Jesus. And what we're going to be talking about over the next several weeks is 7 things that you can uniquely give away that the whole world can't give away. You can give it away because you know Jesus. And I think of these things as legacy gifts. My daughter just turned 16, which is, wow, a big deal, right? When you have one of your kids and they turn 16, it's those moments where you just go back. And I was going back in my mind and just thinking about some memories. And one of the things I used to say to my daughter when she was 2 years old is I would say to her, "Sweetheart, what is the one thing you can never do?" And she would say, "Grow up, Daddy." And I'd say, "Oh, yes, you can never grow up." Which is the cutest thing ever when they're 2. You might regret it when they're like 22. So just keep that in mind, parents. But she celebrated her 16th, and it was one of those great birthdays. And on that birthday, her grandmother gave her something that was really special to her, a piece of jewelry that her mother had given to her when she had turned 16, and she gave it to my daughter. And it was one of those moments where you're like, this is a legacy gift. This is one of those gifts that is rare to be passed on, and when it is passed on, it's really powerful. And today what I want to talk about is the gift of faith and passing on the gift of faith. Now, when you think about sharing your faith, if you're like me, maybe you get a little bit nervous when you think about sharing your faith with someone because, well, to be quite frank, sharing your faith can be really terrifying at times, right? And our Grandview campus, if you're a part of our Grandview launch team, we're going to be starting a new campus, and one of the things that those who are part of our launch team they're praying about, how can I share my faith? How can I invite people into this incredible community that we're starting in Grandview? And that's a really scary thing, to share your faith. But there's something about faith that has to be passed on. And it doesn't matter how scary it is, there's something that is inherent to faith, that when you encounter God, something happens in you, and something is deposited in you, and it's got to get out. And I don't know anyone who hasn't had a genuine encounter with God where that's not true. I think it's part of the genetic code of faith is to be given away. And the Apostle Paul described it this way. And we hear these words every week when we take communion. He said, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you." That's faith. It's something that is received, and it's something that's passed on. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I think about those moments where you have an opportunity to share your faith, and sometimes I think about these, once-in-a-lifetime magical moments. Some of you started school in the last couple of weeks, and maybe you're in study hall. I think about, or maybe you're in college and you're in biology, and you meet this guy in your class. Let's call him Anthony. Or maybe you are at Thanksgiving dinner, and Aunt Esther is there, and Aunt Esther and Anthony don't know the Lord. And all of a sudden one day, or maybe at that Thanksgiving dinner, they look at you and Anthony says, I heard you're a Christian. I too have a God-shaped hole in my life. Tell me, what must I do to be saved? Right? Think about that moment. You're like, yeah, thank you for asking, Anthony, because I've been preparing for this moment my whole life. And then you just begin to tell Anthony and Aunt Esther what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And they, when you begin speaking, gold just falls out of your mouth, as you're talking about Jesus, and you sound eloquent and brilliant, and all of a sudden, Anthony falls on his knees, and Esther falls on her knees, and all of a sudden, you are like Michael Landon from Highway to Heaven. Now, I had to do that because Pastor Charles he's been throwing out some 80s references the last couple of times. So I'm like, game on, dude, game on. You don't know this reference. He's an angel sent by God to do that extraordinary thing that nobody else could do. And sometimes we think about that's how it is with passing on our faith. There's gonna be some moment, and suddenly, the spotlight from heaven shines and everything gets real slow, and then we have this moment. Well, actually, if that is what you're waiting for, you will wait the rest of your life, because that's not how faith is passed on. And so what we're gonna see today is that faith is passed on really different than we might think. And so today what I want to talk about is how to share your faith. So if you would pray with me, and we're going to take a look at the Bible together. Father, thank you that I know for many that are listening, we've been encountered by you. And Lord, something has changed within us, and we have something within us that can only be passed on. And I pray, Lord, that you would stir up that thing inside by your Holy Spirit. I pray, God, for a church that passes on to the next generation this work of God in our lives. I pray for those young people who are listening, those middle school and high school and college students and 20-somethings, God, that, Lord, I pray that this would be a church where you meet us in dramatic ways and powerful ways, and you do something that changes us. Lord, we need you. Would you pour out your Spirit, put your power on this message, we ask, in Jesus' name. Amen. So if you have a Bible, open up to Deuteronomy. We're going to take a look at Deuteronomy, and I'm going to be in chapter 6, and here's what we read in verse 1. It says, "These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you." Now, to appreciate this passage in the Bible, you've got to understand the big picture of what's happening here. What's happening here is Moses is communicating to Israel in one of the longest sermons probably ever preached. The whole book of Deuteronomy is one long sermon, and Moses is preaching that sermon. So if you think we preach long in the Vineyard, and Sawmill Campus, I know that Ryan can go a little long sometimes, but if you think we preach long, trust me, Moses went forever. And what Moses is doing here is he is preaching his last message, and after he preaches this message, here's what's going to happen. He's going to climb up a mountain, and he's going to die. And so Moses, in this message, in Deuteronomy, is determined to pass on everything that has happened over the previous 40 years. And, well, if you're familiar with some of the story, you know that what had happened was incredibly dramatic. God had delivered the Israelites from Egypt and led them out into, on their way to the promised land. And on their way in this 40-year journey, they went through wanderings in the desert. There were rebellions. There was incredible worship and special guidance. There were wars and commandments and sacrifices. And here at this moment, Moses is standing at the edge of the Jordan River on the plains of Moab, and all of the Israelites are before him, and he is telling them, this is what it means to believe. And the reason that I'm telling you this, Moses says, is so that you and your children and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live. Now, the concern that Moses had was the same concern that you and I have, and especially as we get older, and maybe you're someone who has nephews and nieces, or maybe you have children of your own, and you have a concern in your heart, and you say, I want to see my children and my children's children follow the Lord. I want them to love the Lord and serve the Lord. That's a concern that we all have, and we also know that there are incredible challenges along with that. Even if you read the rest of the book of Deuteronomy and you keep reading through the Old Testament, you realize pretty quick Moses didn't do what he wanted to do real well, right? Like, there were some problems. There was a lot of rebellion. There was a lot of turning away from God. There was a lot of challenges that Moses had in transmitting the faith from one generation to another. And we also have challenges, don't we? We know, friends, that we are living in what is called a post-Christian society. Post-Christian. Now, I lived in a post-Christian society in Europe for 7 years. And one of the things I learned and was interested in learning is, how is it that in a post-Christian society, people not only come to faith in Jesus, but pass along their faith to their generations that follow them. And what I learned is that we have massive challenges. In Europe, which is, the center at one time of the whole Christian world, where, all of the missionaries came out of, Europe is no longer Christian. It's far from Christian. The fastest growing religion in Europe is no longer Christianity, it's Islam. If you're British, you're more likely to believe in aliens than you are to believe in God. And if you are British and you are a Christian and you're a parent, you only have a 50-50 chance of passing along your faith to your kids. Now we say, well, that's across the pond. Well, listen, friends, it's right here in America as well. If you look at studies that indicate, those who no longer identify as religious, with each generation, it's changing dramatically. The oldest generation, the silent generation, 18% of them were religiously unaffiliated, and with millennials, it's 43%. It's a massive increase. And we don't know yet where Gen Z is going to land, but the trend lines are not good, friends. And so the question for us is, how is it faith is passed on? Well, Moses tells us, first of all, not to focus on the faith of those who are following us. He tells us first to focus on our own faith. Look in verse 4, he says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Now this prayer is the most famous. It's actually called the Shema. The Shema, it literally means to hear. Hear, O Israel. Shema is hear. This is actually the central doctrine, the central belief that distinguished Israelite belief from all of the other nations around them, because it said God is one, there is one God. That is the heart of the Shema. So the Shema was a belief, but it was more than a belief, it was a prayer. The Shema was actually the most, and it still is to this day, the most important prayer for Jews to pray. Jews will pray this prayer, the Shema, twice a day, and they teach their children to pray this prayer as the last prayer that they pray before they go to sleep at night. And so the Shema is a belief, the Shema is a prayer, but the Shema is more than that. It is a pointer to a whole life of devotion to God. And you see that in the next verse. In verse 5, it says this: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Now, we know that this is an important verse in the Bible, not just for Jews, but for Christians, because Jesus repeated this teaching. And you might be familiar with that. Jesus also taught, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Now, what is it that Jesus and Moses were teaching when they taught this? Sometimes we think, well, they were, it's a prayer about our anthropology. It's about how to love God with our different parts. And so what it means to love God with our minds is we need to think more about God. Or maybe you say, well, to love God with my heart, I just need to feel more loving feelings with my heart. That's what Moses and Jesus are getting at. And while those things are certainly applicable, that's not what the Shema and this prayer is getting at. What it's getting at, and what Moses and Jesus are doing, is they are piling on words, piling on images to communicate one very simple thing. And you see that because the last word in this pile of words is strength. And this word in Hebrew is meodeka. Meodeka. And what it means is this: you're very much everything. Your strength is your very much everything. And so what Moses and what Jesus were saying when they said, love the Lord your God, is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with your very much everything. Everything about your life should be in love with God. It should be devoted to God. Now, friends, why is Moses telling the Israelites to focus on their own devotion to God? Well, if you want to know the factors of why is it that faith is passed on to the next generation, there are studies that have been done. One of them with thousands of young adults. Study indicated some really important and interesting findings. And what they did was they followed kids and teenagers into young adulthood. And they said, what is it about a teenager that holds on to their faith when they're a young adult? Because we know that that's the big transition. What is it that allows someone who's a teenager to hold on to their faith? And what is it that those factors are? Well, there were a number of factors. There is no silver bullet, the studies found, but there are certain factors that are really important and other ones that are not important at all. And actually, some of the ones that you would think are important are actually, they don't even show up. They don't even register. For example, you might think, well, if I put my kid in Christian school, then they'll probably hold on to their faith as a young adult. Didn't even register. Oh, you might think, what I need to do is make sure that my kids go on mission trips because, then they'll be out, they'll experience what it's like to be, people that are serving, and helping people. Didn't register. And some things that you think might register in a bad way actually were the opposite. So, for example, some would think, well, what I don't want my teenager to experience is pushback because of their faith in Jesus. You think, well, if my kid gets made fun of then man, it's going to really harm them. They'll probably lose their faith if they get made fun of for Jesus. And actually, the reverse is true. When you experience pushback because of your faith in Jesus, your faith grows. And so what is it, though, that was the factor that you and I need to hear? The factor that registered above them all is this factor. If a teenager or a child has a parent or a grandparent or a step-parent in their lives who love God with their very much everything, then faith is more likely to be held on when a child becomes an adult. Because what happens when you love God with your very much everything is it shows up more than just on Sundays, it shows up in your whole life. And so you bring your kids to church. That was another indicator of those who held on. But you don't just bring your kids to church. You love God with your very much everything. God is your all in all. And when God is your all in all, it is contagious. And young people see it and they experience and they say, that is what I want. That is what I need. And you know, there is no better example of this than what we saw last week. I love the video, and if you were here, you saw a powerful video. The Story Continues video, an update, and a story about the Bixler family. And if you didn't see this, you need to go home, and if you're at home, you need to look it up, and if you have kids, you need to watch it with them. Because it's a story about 3 generations here within the church who have been impacted and changed by the power of Jesus. And it's about older generations so in love with Jesus that younger generations say, that's what I want as well. And the youngest of the generations is a child who was baptized earlier this year, Sophia. And Sophia, here's what she said, and I love this. She said, my dad decided to take this step of faith, and the Vineyard did it for him. And to just think that I was following in his footsteps and doing something that God loved, that made me really happy. Friends, that captures it. That captures it. If you want to be someone who sees your faith passed on to the next generation, make God your very much everything. Be in love with God with everything that you have and all that you are. Because faith is more likely to be passed on by us when that is the reality. The second thing we see is that faith is passed on by people who know that something has happened. Now, let me unpack that, but first look with me at verse 6. Moses goes on and he says, these commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk on the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Now Moses says here, these commandments that I give you. And if you read the rest of this chapter, or you read the rest of the book of Deuteronomy. Indeed, if you read the whole Old Testament, and if any of you have tried to read the book of Leviticus, you know that this is true. You're like, what? Like, seriously? I got like 4 verses in, I'm done. I can't do this. All of these commandments and all of these stipulations and all of these do's and don'ts and all of this stuff, these commandments are the things that a lot of people focus on when they focus on transmitting the faith to the next generation. The commandments, they're what I would call codes and conduct, beliefs and behavior. You believe the right things and you behave the right way. That's the heart of faith. And friends, a lot of you grew up in contexts like that. And today, or maybe in some point in the past, you had a really hard time believing because of that. Because that was your diet. And many people in the next generation are walking away from Christian faith because that is the diet of faith that they received. It's all about doing the right thing, believing the right thing. And I understand why Christianity is reduced to that. Because these things are manageable, right? They can be analyzed. They can be understood. Beliefs can be calculated. Behaviors can be scored. And the problem, though, is that when Christianity is reduced to codes and to conduct and beliefs and behaviors, the problem is we get what Dallas Willard called the gospel of sin management. And friends, the gospel of sin management is not the gospel of Jesus. And the gospel of sin management is not the gospel that the next generation needs to hear. And the gospel of sin management is not going to transform the next generation and create disciples of Jesus. But friends, it is easy to focus on the gospel of sin management. But you need to know here, even though beliefs and behaviors are important, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of that in the Bible. But these are not the gospel. They are not the good news that Jesus delivered. And they are not even the good news that Moses is focused on. I want you to see this because a little bit later in this passage, you look down at verse 20 and you see Moses explain this. And he says, in the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God has commanded you? Tell him this. Now listen to his response. Tell him, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before our eyes, the Lord sent signs and wonders, great and terrible, on Egypt and Pharaoh and on his whole household. But he brought us out from there to bring us in and give us the land he promised on oath to our ancestors. Moses is talking about the gospel. Moses is saying, if you want to know what is central to pass on, it is the story of what God has done to deliver us. It is about what God has done to stretch out his hand, to rescue us, to save us, to change the course of our whole lives and all of our trajectories. That is what you are to tell them. Friends, if you want to know what faith is a recounting of the great things that have happened. If you read the Bible, faith in the Bible is the recounting of amazing things that have happened, things that Moses is talking about, things that God did through Jesus, who came into this world and suffered and died on a cross and was raised from the dead. The creed is an accounting of great things that have happened. I believe, and we read this occasionally together when we take communion, I believe in God, the maker of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, who was born of the Virgin Mary, who suffered under Pontius Pilate, who rose again on the third day, who descended into hell. It is an account of things that have happened. This happened to Christ. That happened to Christ. If you want to know what faith is not a series of doctrinal statements. It is a series of things that have happened, and because those things happened, everything has changed. Everything. And listen, faith is passed on through people that know that something has happened. But not just something that has happened 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. Do you know that faith is passed on by people who know that something has happened to them? Faith is passed on by those who have experienced a great happening in our lives. And when that great happening occurs, everything is changed. God reaches out his arm into your life. He stretches out his hand into your life. That is the great happening in our lives. And friends, that is the gospel. That is the gospel. That is what is passed on. It is not about commands. It is not about beliefs and behaviors. It is about something that has happened. And so let me ask you, do you know what has happened? Do you know it? Not just back then, but right now, here, in your life, in your bones, in your experience, and your walking, in your days. Do you know what has happened? Because that is the gospel. And the gospel is passed on through people who know it, but not just know it. It's passed on by people who tell their story. And that's what Moses tells us here. He says this: impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk on the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Moses is saying, tell your story. Tell it regularly. Tell it often. Tell it naturally as you go through life. If you're a parent, from the morning you get up, you are a storyteller of God's greatness all through the day. And it happens in the most natural and the simplest of ways. When I send my child off to school, can I pray a blessing? When I greet you in the evening, I say, tell me, did you see God at work in your life today? Can I pray a blessing on you as you go to sleep at night? These are the simple ways that you tell your story, and you tell it over and over and over again. Now, if you don't know your story, then I want to ask you this week to write it down. Your story, your experience of God's happening in your life. When Julie and I started out in ministry, we started out in youth ministry. And one of the things that we did all the time was we just shared our story. And we had, our story that we could share in 10 minutes, and 3 minutes, and 30 seconds, and 3 seconds. You got a story to tell. But listen, I know that not everyone here knows their story. And so this week, take some time, write it down. And out loud, I want you to tell your story. Go on a walk and just say it out loud. What is my story, God, of what you have done? And here's the next thing I want you to do. I want you to get into a place where you can share your story with someone who is younger than you, someone who is behind you, someone who doesn't know the story. And listen, you don't have to be a parent to do this. You should do it if you're a parent. I encourage you this week, if you're a parent and your kids have never heard your God story, I want you to share it with them. If you're a grandparent, it's going to take a little bit more planning, a little bit more effort, but I want you to share your God story. And the reason for that is kids, while they don't want to hear the do's and the don'ts, what they absolutely want to hear is that God is real. God is alive. God is moving, and he has done something in your life. And if you are not in a place where you can share your story, I want to encourage you to get in a place like that. And we have one of them here at Vineyard Columbus. And I want to move you to get involved. We're doing a series on Next Gen. I want to move you into spaces where you are around the next generation. You don't have to be someone who's incredibly articulate. You don't have to be cool. You don't have to be young. You can be yourself. And the great thing is, when you are yourself and you're in environments with people who are curious about God, you will have an opportunity to share your story. And so I want to encourage you. We're starting our student ministry in 2 weeks across all of our campuses. Would you consider investing in the next generation by coming out, joining, investing in this next generation and saying, I will be in an environment where I can share my faith in Jesus. Friends, we right now as a church are turning away kids and students. We're turning them away for one simple reason, because we don't have enough people that have yet said, I will be there. I'll open up my life. I'll open up my time. I will show up. Friends, we need you. We need you. And God will use you. And so this week, go on vineyardcolumbus.org this week and pray about serving. Now, I want to just close with sharing just a couple of brief stories that I think will be an encouragement to you. Because, we often feel like, well, my story is not that great. I really don't have anything that great to share. This week in our small group, our leader asked the question, think back to when, God came into your life, when that happening occurred. And who was it in your life who shared with you? What was that like? And also think about a time where you've been able to share your faith and surprising things happened. Well, one of my friends who's in our group, he shared a really cool story. Now, my friend is also my favorite Christian rapper. He actually traveled around the world, and some of you know him because you grew up listening to his music. And at a show one time, somebody came up to him, a kid, and said, hey, could I talk to you about your story? Could you share your story with me? About what God did in your life. And well, my friend had, like many of us, kind of a complicated relationship with church and Christianity and the whole thing. And so he would, he heard this question. He was in his 20s, and he's like, I just, with half faith and half unbelief and a lot of awkwardness, I shared my story, and it was like super random. It made no difference in this kid's life. And he really just forgot about it, forgot the whole story until recently. This kid who is now a young adult who came back to him, and he found him, and he said, listen, I want to thank you because my whole life changed because of you. He's like, really? He's like, why? What happened? He said, I'm a youth pastor now because you shared your story with me. My friend was like, head was blown. Like, what? Like that ridiculous, pathetic thing I shared with you? You're a youth pastor now? That's crazy. Like, I hardly believed it myself. Here's a second story. My story when I came to faith in Jesus. I was at a camp, I was hearing about Jesus, and as I was hearing about Jesus, every day I was talking with one of our leaders. She was a college student, and we would sit, and I would just ask her questions about what I was hearing at this camp. And what was happening inside of me was like an earthquake. Everything in my life interiorly was changing. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't put words to it. I was having these conversations with her that were completely altering my life. I gave my life to Jesus that week, and nothing has been the same since. Now, here's the thing as I think back to that story. I don't remember her name. I had so many conversations over the course of the week. She was the most important person in my life that week. I can't tell you her name. Now, here's the encouragement for you. You have a story to tell. God wants you to share your story. Good news, it's not about you. It's not dependent on you. It's not about how much faith you have when you share your story. It's not about how eloquent you are. It's just a matter of you showing up and telling your story. Because God will use it in surprising ways, friends.